Hello viewers, you're watching the Policy Times. I am your host Akram, and Policy Times is India's only media which highlights, focus and creates awareness on public policy and foreign affair issues. Foreign affair, India being a young, dynamic and influential country geopolitically, economically, socially and culturally, we need to understand the emergence of international issues globally and how and assess how are they going to impact on us. To talk on that, we have Mr. Commodore Lalit Kapur, who is the senior fellow at Delhi Policy Group and expert on international affairs, specifically Indo Pacific issues. Now, Indo Pacific is a region which has a paramount of importance for India. India being a decent global power in terms of trade and economic relations with other part of the world, the Indo-Pacific region today plays a very crucial and important role for geopolitics as well as for economic relevance. Now, we will try to understand what is Indo-Pacific, what is the importance of Indo-Pacific for India, how is the world viewing in Indo-Pacific region, and what should we do from here so that we have a better control, understanding and strategy to promote India in the Indo-Pacific region. Commodore Lalit Kapur, welcome to our show. The first question I want to understand for our viewers is, can you give us the historical perspective of Indo-Pacific region for Indians?
Thank you, Akram. Thank you for having me on your show. As far as the historical perspective of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it's really not something which is new.
Right.
If I go back into the pre-colonial period, we had trade flowing through what is called now the Indo-Pacific, from China, an ancient civilization, through the Indian Ocean to India, another ancient civilization, and both of these actually comprised the economic center of gravity of the world at that time. This trade thereafter went across the Arabian Sea, through the Mediterranean into Western Europe. In fact, it was basically the desire to take control of this trade that set Christopher Columbus out on his voyage to discover India. He went westward and discovered America, and Vasco da Gama, round the coast of Africa,
he ended up coming here.
Ended up coming to India.
Right.
The impact of that for both China and India, which were unused to a maritime outlook, was that Western Europe was able to take control of the entire trade from China as well as from India.
Right.
And the result was a shift of economic power from Asia to Western Europe. At that time, America was also just a colony. Now we take this forward a couple of centuries, maybe a bit more, to America's rise into global prominence.
Right.
When America emerged as a world power around the First World War, the economic center of the gravity was Western Europe. The emerging big economy was America. So it was transatlantic trade,
right,
which connected the two, which became the key determinant of what was happening in the globe. This position has gradually started to change. Global economic power is shifting towards Asia. In fact, as of now, as we speak, more than 40% of the world's nominal GDP rests in Asia.
Right.
And acknowledged projections are that in the next few years, this figure will exceed 50%. The other big economic power in the world still remains USA and North America.
Right. Naturally.
So it is connectivity between these two regions that becomes predominant for global prosperity. And thus you get the Indo Pacific. From the American perspective, it is the Pacific. But from Asia's perspective, it is the connection not just to America, but also to Western Europe, which is the other significant
Market.
the other significant contributor to global GDP. So when you look at that perspective, the Indian Ocean today has become the key connector for global trade. And essentially that is why
we would, for our viewers, we would like to understand what is the economic relevance of Indo-Pacific now and Indian Ocean.
So the economic relevance of the Indo-Pacific now, like I said, the two big centers of economic production today are Asia, which comprises East Asia and South Asia, and the Americas. Between the two of them, they today add up to close to about 64% of the world's GDP. And so the connectivity between them becomes paramount. The fundamental factor, of course, is that transportation over the seas is always going to be exponentially cheaper than transportation over land.
Right. Land or air.
Or air. Absolutely correct. As I mentioned, the other big power is Western Europe. Economically, it's about 23% of the global nominal GDP. So with Asia, you get another about 60% of the global GDP in the connection between Asia and Europe.
Right.
And so if I look at global trade, the overwhelming majority of global trade passes through the Indian Ocean. It starts with energy. Close to about 19 million barrels per day of oil flows through the Indian Ocean to consumers predominantly in China, Japan, the so-called tiger economies. Similarly with raw materials. When I look at the trade that is flowing, more than 60% of all the cargo that is unloaded globally is at Asian ports.
Right.
And those Asian ports are basically East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia.
Excellent. We understand that there is a kind of struggle of dominance between world powers in terms of ensuring that who has better control over the region, the Indo-Pacific region. US has its own strategy, own vision for Indo-Pacific. ASEAN countries have recently announced the same. They have their own strategy. China is somehow in Asia, they are already undeclared superpower, and they now want to ensure that they have super control over every part of the Asian region, and especially sea. And the other most important part is Europe. What are the strategies of all these different superpowers or super regions have on Indo-Pacific?
Great. Let me start first with China. For all its aversion to the term Indo-Pacific, China is actually the only country which has a coherent, holistic strategy towards the Indo-Pacific. And that coherent strategy comprises connectivity elements, where it is building up through the Maritime Silk Road an arc of connectivity which will actually connect the whole world to China.
Right.
All of Asia and Europe to China. That's what it's doing. So connectivity elements, building influence through aid is the second part of its strategy. Even if that aid is comes along with, shall I say, ties which are not clearly visible, which force countries into a situation where they become
It's basically
literally dependencies of China.
it's basically a trap.
It's an economic trap.
Economic trap.
Right. The third is military, where China is clearly developing its maritime power so as to be able to control this entire region or actually influence it. Maybe control is a strong term, to
Right.
influence this entire region to act as China desires. Right? So, in that, China has launched what is probably the biggest maritime expansion the world has seen after World War II. It is developing a network of bases throughout the Indian Ocean. It is developing the means to sustain maritime force throughout this region. Right? That is China. When I look at the US, till about a few years ago, till about 3 or 4 years ago, the US still harbored dreams of including China into the global order as a responsible stakeholder. Those dreams now lie shattered. However, the US has not yet come out with a coherent strategy which encompasses all elements to increase its influence in the Indo Pacific. Their strategy is primarily military at present.
Right.
The economic and connectivity elements are still to become visible. And military elements by themselves are not ever going to be enough. When I look at Western Europe, what has happened is that Western Europe has become too involved, too inward looking to matter much. Western Europe has also neglected its maritime capability over the course of the last few decades. So you have Britain, which has some semblance of maritime power left, maritime capability left, but their focus is much more into the Middle East, into the Persian Gulf, with very little to be able to capacity to be able to go beyond.
Right.
You have France, which has huge maritime territory in the Indian Ocean as well as in the Pacific. But their maritime capacity has also atrophied over the years. So their ability to exercise influence is very limited. What remains is America. So by and large, Western Europe will go along with America in this matter. Now when I look at ASEAN, I need to bring out that all your ASEAN-centric institutions arose at a time where great power competition had ended. It was a unipolar world which was dominated by America. So great power competition and geopolitics played no part in the ASEAN's outlook.
Right.
The objective was to incorporate everybody and to develop mechanisms to deal with maritime challenges, which were essentially either humanitarian challenges arising out of natural disasters or search and rescue, things like that, or challenges of governance with issues such as piracy, terrorism, illegal fishing, and so on. So ASEAN institutions were devised to cater for this. ASEAN's military capacity is negligible. To be able to stand up to a great power challenge and to prevent that great power from imposing its views, the pressing need is military capacity, as history has shown over the course of millennia.
Right.
And that military capacity is non-existent in ASEAN. So when ASEAN claims centrality, to deal with the emerging geopolitical competition,
Right.
it is claiming that centrality without capacity. How effective that will be, I have severe doubts.
We have to wait and see that.
Right.
Japan is another country which is missing from the chart. How do you
Correct.
see Japan's view on that?
Japan is actually a very interesting proposition. Japan is has for long been introverted. Japan is often described as not a normal country in that it outsources its security completely to the United States.
US. So it has economic influence, but
So it has
militarily,
economic influence. It invests enormously in connectivity throughout the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia.
right.
In fact, in many areas, its investment is larger than China,
Yeah.
including in India. But it has no military capacity to protect that.
that is taking impact.
Capability.
No, now we come to the most important country from our perspective is India. What is India's strategy for Indo-Pacific, and what is it currently doing, and what can and should it do more so that we have better, more influence and control over the region?
Again, a very interesting question. Fundamentally, India has not been used to looking seawards. After independence, in fact, let me go to before independence. Before independence, it was the Royal Navy controlled through the Admiralty in London, which looked after India's maritime security. India looked after only continental security. After we became independent, our focus was on our continental problems. It started with the Kashmir problem, 1947-48. Then you went into the 1962 war with China. Then you went into 1965. Then you went into 1971.
Right.
So India hasn't really paid much attention to the seas. It is only after we opened up to the world that the importance of sea power became evident to our political leaders, because you needed to import energy, and that energy had to travel across the seas. And you needed to be able to secure that. And similarly, you wanted to connect with the external world. That connection had to be through the seas. You can't connect with the external world to your west because Pakistan blocks you. You can't connect with the external world to the north because China blocks you. You can't connect with the external world to the east on land because there is no network. You're building
There's
the
no
highways
network.
now. So the only connection that you have is through the seas. So we started paying attention to the seas not really very long ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and that's actually very little in the life of a nation. We are conscious of the problems, but it will take time to build up the capacity to deal with all of them. Our vision is that we want to be able to secure our strategic perimeters, which I perceive lie at the gates of the Indian Ocean. To the east, it is the various straits which connect the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. To the west, it is the Straits of Hormuz, the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, and then across South Africa. This is the region that India should consider its strategic perimeter. And this is the area where we need to be able to develop the capability to act not just against the challenges of governance of this space in peacetime, but to any challenge that may arise which changes the way of life as we see it. Our preference has been for the democratic way of life.
Right.
And what seems to be emerging, what China seeks to propagate, is more of an authoritarian way of running the region.
So we had Commodore Lalit Kapur sharing the expertise, his experience and expertise on Indo-Pacific. So till now, it's quite evident and clear that Indo-Pacific plays a very crucial role for India. Different countries are economically and trade-wise, it has tremendous relevance. different countries are trying. So far, we understood that China is playing a critical role and influence in the region. America has recently developed a vision for Indo Pacific, but it is still more or less limited or confined within militarily, and it has come to economic and connectivity. Japan has huge influence connectivity wise and economy wise, but it has little military influence over the region. India, as Commodore said, it has started late, but it is laying a foundation or a strategy roadmap to come to the region. So you were watching the Policy Times. We will come back with a similar vibrating important discussions with another expert. So thank you, Commodore Lalit Kapur, for joining us in this episode. Viewers, keep watching the Policy Times.